The smell of burning silk would stay with her for the rest of her life. Seraphina Ashcroft knelt on the cold stone floor of the laundry courtyard, her hands plunged into the ashes of what had been, only moments ago, the most beautiful thing she had ever owned. Her mother's wedding gown, carefully remade for her first proper ball, ivory silk embroidered with silver thread by her mother's own hands in the final months of her life. 12 years Seraphina had kept it folded in tissue paper beneath her bed. 12 years she had waited for the evening she could wear it and feel her mother standing beside her. Even now, even in a house that no longer remembered the woman had ever existed. "You look ridiculous down there." Her stepmother's voice sliced through the courtyard like a paring knife. Seraphina did not lift her head. She could feel Lady Margaret's satisfaction without needing to see it, a heavy, cloying thing that filled the air the way her rose perfume had always done. "It was an accident, of course," Margaret continued, arranging her gloves with exaggerated care. The candle tipped over while Annalise was admiring the stitching. "Such a shame. Still, we cannot delay the carriage for you, Seraphina. The Duke of Ravencross receives callers only once a season, and Annalise must not miss her introduction." The Duke of Ravencross. The name hung in the smoke-thickened air like a verdict. Every unmarried woman in 3 counties had been dreaming of tonight for weeks. And every unmarried woman in 3 counties was about to ascend the marble steps of Ravencross Manor in gowns of pearl and crystal and velvet, while Seraphina Ashcroft knelt in a courtyard full of cinders. She finally raised her eyes. Her stepmother stood framed in the doorway like a portrait commissioned to flatter her. Behind her, Annalise, 16 and lovely, and Seraphina had long ago learned, entirely unaware of the meanness of her own hands, adjusted a pale blue ribbon at her throat and refused to meet her stepsister's gaze. "An accident," Seraphina repeated. The word tasted like soot. "Precisely." Margaret's smile did not reach her eyes. It never did. Not since the day 6 years ago when she had stood at the altar beside Seraphina's father and decided, apparently on sight, that her new stepdaughter would never be more than an inconvenience wearing a dead woman's face. "You may go to the ball in your gray muslin if you wish. I should not stop you. But one must ask, my dear, what such a gown would accomplish in a room full of duchesses." She swept away in a rustle of taffeta, Annalise trailing behind her like a moth pulled by a cold flame. The carriage wheels rattled over the cobbles and were gone. For a long time, Seraphina did not move. The wind turned, blew a drift of ashes across her lap, and settled there. If you are enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Now let us return to the courtyard, where a young woman knelt in the ruins of her last connection to her mother and discovered, in the quiet, that something inside her had not burned. She stood up. Her knees ached. Her palms were smeared with gray and her hair had fallen loose from its pins, and the gray muslin she wore for chores smelled of lye and laundry steam. She looked, she knew, like a scullery maid who had wandered too far from her post. And yet, her father's voice, so many years ago now that she sometimes feared she had invented it, returned to her as if borne in on the wind. "You are your mother's daughter, Sarah. That is the only inheritance that matters. Do not let them make you forget it." He had died 3 winters past, worn away by a cough and by a wife who had slowly, methodically, carved him out of his own house. Seraphina had held his hand at the end. He had squeezed her fingers with what little strength remained and whispered her mother's name. The carriage was gone. The horses, certainly. But her father had kept an old bay mare named Hetty in the back paddock, a placid creature too gentle for Margaret to bother selling. And the side saddle was still in the tack room where he had left it. 3 miles to Ravencross Manor. The roads were dry. The moon was up. She did not go inside to change. If she went inside, she would lose her nerve. If she went inside, Margaret's housekeeper would find her and remind her, with that particular pitying cruelty only servants of cruel mistresses ever perfected, of her place. She went to the paddock. She saddled Hetty herself, fingers shaking on the buckles. She pulled herself up and turned the mare's head toward the long pale ribbon of road that wound between the hedgerows toward the Duke's estate. The gray muslin snapped against her legs in the wind. Ashes clung to the hem. Her hair streamed behind her unbound. She did not care. She was not riding to a ball. She was riding to prove, to herself more than to anyone, that she had not yet been entirely erased. She would think, later, that she should have been afraid. A young woman alone on a country road at night, in a gown unfit for a servant, bound for a house where she had no invitation. But fear had been her companion for so long that she had stopped hearing its voice. What filled her instead, as Hetty's hooves beat steadily against the packed earth and the hedgerows flew past, was something stranger, something almost like joy. At Ravencross Manor, 3 miles away, the Duke had already decided that he hated the evening. Alaric Hawthorne, the 7th Duke of Ravencross, stood at the top of his grand staircase and watched his entrance hall fill with women he had not asked to be introduced to. The ball had not been his idea. It had been his aunt's, Lady Constance Hawthorne, who had arrived at Ravencross 3 months ago with the settled conviction that her nephew had grieved long enough and was now obligated, for the sake of the title, to marry someone before winter. Alaric had told her, in careful and courteous terms, that he had no intention of marrying anyone, this winter or any winter that followed. His aunt had smiled at him the way one smiles at a child who has announced he will live on cake, and sent out 200 invitations the following morning. He was 29. His hair was black and too long, because he had dismissed his valet during his grief and never bothered to hire another. His eyes were the gray of pewter in winter light, and he had not, to his own memory, used them to smile in 3 years. Not since Cecilia. Not since the influenza took her in a single terrible week, 3 months after their wedding, when he had not yet finished learning the particular sound of her laughter. He had loved her without understanding, at the time, that loving her was what he had been doing. He had understood only when he stood beside her grave and realized that the entire architecture of his future had been made of her, and that he would now have to live the rest of his life in its ruins. He had promised himself, that afternoon, that he would never marry again. He had kept that promise as the principal discipline of his life. He had become, in consequence, the most terrifying man in the county. He did not mean to be terrifying. He simply could no longer pretend to feel what other people wished to see him feel, and pretense, he had discovered, was most of what society asked of a man. "You are glowering, my dear." His aunt's voice, amused, at his elbow. He turned his head. Lady Constance was a small, sharp-eyed woman in dove-gray silk, rather the color of his mood, and she looked up at him with the patient affection of a woman who had changed his childhood nappies and therefore refused to be afraid of him. "I am not glowering. I am observing." "You are glowering at the observation." She tucked her hand through his arm. "They are not going to bite you, Alaric. Most of them are terrified of you already. Try to be kind. Ask one of them to dance. You need not propose marriage. I only ask for 1 quadrille. I do not dance. You danced with Cecilia." He flinched. She felt it, and her hand tightened on his sleeve in apology. "Forgive me," she said quietly. "That was not fair. It was entirely fair." His voice was rough. "You are correct. I did dance with Cecilia. I do not dance now because there is no one in that room with whom dancing would mean anything. I will not perform affection I do not feel, aunt. It is a small cruelty to the young woman and a larger one to myself." Lady Constance was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "One day, Alaric, you will meet someone and the room will go quiet around her. I do not know when. I do not know who. But she is out there somewhere. I have prayed for her every night for 3 years. I only ask that when she comes, you have the courage to see her." He did not answer. He watched the crush of ivory and pearl and silver below, the laughter that sounded to his ear like glass chiming, the practiced smiles and the practiced sighs, and he thought, with a weariness that had become the deepest thing in him, that his aunt prayed to a God who no longer listened. He descended the stairs. He was introduced, as the evening required, to daughter after daughter. Lady Annalise Ashcroft curtsied to him with her mother, the widow Ashcroft, standing triumphant at her shoulder. Alaric inclined his head, said 3 courteous words, and remembered nothing of her 5 minutes later. He was introduced to Miss Eleanor Fawkes, whose mother had written him 6 letters in the last year. He was introduced to the Carrington twins, who were indistinguishable and who giggled in unison. He was introduced, eventually, to so many young women that their names ran together like watercolors in rain. He found himself, at 11:15, standing alone at the long terrace doors, looking out into the dark. The gardens at Ravencross were vast and formal, all clipped yew and gravel walks and pale roses that had been planted by his grandmother. Beyond them, past the low stone wall, the parkland stretched away toward the road. A single lamp burned at the gatehouse. The rest was moonlight. He did not know, afterwards, why he opened the door and stepped out. Perhaps he simply needed a breath of air that had not been exhaled by 300 strangers. Perhaps some part of him, the part his aunt prayed for, heard something coming down the road. He stood at the terrace balustrade. He breathed in the cold. And then, faintly, the sound of hoofbeats. Not a carriage. A single horse, moving at a steady canter, and the rider, when she came into the light of the gatehouse lamp, was a woman alone. Alaric did not move. He watched her ride up the long drive. The gray horse unhurried, the rider straight-backed and apparently in no distress. She was not dressed for a ball. He could see that at a quarter of a mile. Some pale gown, without color or ornament, and her hair loose, streaming in the wind like something out of a Scottish ballad. He thought, for a strange lost moment, that she might be a ghost. He had heard of such things on country roads. Then she drew close enough to the house for him to see her face, and he understood that she was no ghost at all. She was a living woman, pale and tired and utterly, impossibly composed, riding up to his front door at the height of a ball to which she had clearly not been invited. She stopped the horse at the foot of the steps. A groom came out of the shadows, startled, and took the reins. The young woman swung down from the saddle with an unschooled grace that no drawing master had taught her. Her boots touched the gravel. She shook out her skirt, such as it was, and Alaric saw, even from the terrace, that the hem was smeared gray, with soot, with ashes. She looked up. Their eyes met across the moonlit distance. He felt, exactly as his aunt had promised him he would one day feel, the room go quiet around her. Only there was no room. There was only the cold air and the sound of his own pulse and the gray eyes of a stranger who had ridden 3 miles through the dark in a gown made of cinders. He came down the steps before he had decided to. She did not retreat. She did not curtsy. She watched him come, and when he stopped 3 paces from her, she lifted her chin in a manner that was not pride, exactly, but was a near relation of it. "I do not know you, sir." "No," he said. He heard, with a distant academic interest, that his voice had gone soft. "I do not believe you do. I have not been announced. I was not invited. I came without escort." She said each of these things as one might read out the charges in a courtroom. "If I am to be turned away, I would rather it be done now, before I have gone any further, and I would rather it be done by whoever has the authority to do it, so that no one else is obliged to." Alaric found, in the hollow of his chest, that he wanted to laugh. He had not wanted to laugh at anything in 3 years. It startled him. He controlled his face. "And if I told you," he said, "that the authority to turn you away rests only with me, then I would thank you for your clarity, and ask you for 5 minutes to rest my horse before I rode her home. You are the Duke of Ravencross." "I am." She closed her eyes. Only for a moment. Her mouth moved in what might have been a prayer or a private curse. When she opened her eyes again, she was looking at him with the exhausted steadiness of a woman who had used up every reserve of courage she possessed and would not now waste any of it on pretending. "My name is Seraphina Ashcroft," she said. "My stepsister is already at your ball. She was introduced to you earlier this evening, I am certain. My stepmother burned my mother's wedding gown this afternoon because she did not wish to see me in it. I did not come here to be presented to you, your grace. I did not come here to secure a proposal. I came here because if I had stayed in that courtyard 1 moment longer, I would have forgotten who I was. So I came. I have arrived. I have seen the house. That is enough. You may now send me away with a clear conscience. I will not make trouble. I promise you that." She finished. She folded her hands in front of her and waited. Alaric looked at her. He looked at her for a long time. Long enough for the groom to become uncomfortable and drift with the horse toward the stable yard and leave them alone at the foot of the steps. Long enough for the noise of the ball inside the house to recede until it was only a distant ringing, like bells heard from the bottom of a lake. He looked at her, and he saw, all at once and without any of the words that might have made it tidy, that he had spent 3 years waiting for someone to tell him something real. Not a compliment, not a condolence, not a carefully rehearsed remark about the weather or the roads or the season. Something real. And this strange, exhausted young woman, with ashes on her hem and her mother's death in her voice, had ridden 3 miles through the dark to say the first real thing he had heard spoken aloud in all that time. "Miss Ashcroft," he said, and his voice was quieter than he meant it to be. "You will not be sent away." She blinked. "Your Grace, I do not. You will come inside. You will warm yourself by a fire that is not in the ballroom. My aunt will find you a shawl. You will be given food, and you will be given time, and when you wish to go, I will send you home in my own carriage with an outrider, because no woman rides 3 miles alone at night in my county if I can prevent it." He heard himself saying these things and did not quite recognize his own voice. "And before you do any of that, you will tell me your stepmother's name, because whatever I do with the rest of this evening, I mean to remember it." Color, faint and disbelieving, rose in her cheeks. "Your Grace, Alaric. I beg your pardon. My name, when we are not being overheard. It is Alaric. I have not been called that by anyone in 3 years, and I find I should like to hear it, if only once, from a woman who has not arrived at my house intending to marry me." She stared at him, and then, to his astonishment and to hers, she laughed. It was a small laugh, cracked at the edges, half a sob, but it was a laugh. "Alaric," she said, "I promise you, sir, I have never in my life intended to marry you." "Excellent," said the Duke of Ravencross, and held out his arm. "Then we may begin as friends. Come inside, Miss Ashcroft. You are freezing." She looked at his offered arm as if it were a door she had been told all her life was locked. Then, slowly, as carefully as a woman setting her hand upon a wild bird, she laid her fingers on his sleeve. He felt the tremor in them. He covered her hand with his own, briefly, and felt the ash on her skin gritty against his palm. He did not draw away. He held her hand against his arm and drew her gently up the steps of Ravencross Manor, under the blazing chandeliers of the ballroom that had been lit for 200 other women, and into the house. At the top of the steps, before they went in, he paused. He turned his head toward her. In the lamplight, with her hair falling loose and her eyes wet and her chin still, absurdly, bravely lifted, she did not look like a woman who had been erased. She looked like a woman who had refused to be. "Miss Ashcroft," he said, very quietly, so that no one but she would hear it. "I am very glad you came." She did not answer. She could not, perhaps, but her hand tightened, only a little, on his arm. And Alaric Hawthorne, 7th Duke of Ravencross, who had buried his heart 3 years ago in a grave in the chapel yard, felt something stir in his chest that he had promised himself he would never feel again. He walked her through the door. The ballroom did not go quiet all at once. That is only a thing that happens in stories. In life, it goes quiet in stages, beginning at the door and traveling outward in a slow ripple, so that one saw a footman stop speaking, and then a matron, and then a cluster of young women whose heads turned together like startled birds, and then, at last, the musicians, who faltered over a chord and resumed it half a beat late, looking nervously toward the doorway to understand what had interrupted them. What had interrupted them was the Duke of Ravencross. And on the Duke of Ravencross's arm, impossibly, was a young woman in a soot-stained gray muslin gown, with her hair unbound and ashes on her boots. Seraphina felt the attention arrive like a weight settling across her shoulders. She did not lift her head. She had decided, somewhere between the terrace and the door, that she would not apologize to this room for existing in it. If the Duke meant to present her, she would be presented. If he meant to escort her to a fire and a bowl of soup, she would follow. Her task was simple. She had only to keep breathing and to refuse, absolutely, and for as long as she could bear, to be ashamed. At the far side of the room, a woman in pale blue silk went still. Beside her, Lady Margaret Ashcroft had been, at that exact moment, laughing prettily at something a marquis's wife had said. The laugh died on her face in stages, the way the music had died. Her eyes fixed upon her stepdaughter, upon the Duke's hand, covering her stepdaughter's fingers where they lay upon his sleeve. Her mouth opened. No sound came out. The Duke of Ravencross did not look at Lady Margaret Ashcroft. He did not look at anyone. He looked only at the woman on his arm, and he said, loudly enough that the nearest half of the ballroom could hear him distinctly, "You are trembling, Miss Ashcroft. We shall go and find you a fire. The drawing-room is warmer." He turned her, with infinite courtesy, away from the stairs, and he walked her out of the ballroom. Behind them, the musicians, given nothing to work with, began another tune. The conversation resumed. But it resumed differently. It resumed in hisses and whispers and heads bent close. It resumed in the shaken poise of a widow who had believed herself, 20 minutes ago, to be the cleverest woman in 3 counties, and who had just discovered that she was not. And in the small drawing room off the east corridor, the Duke of Ravencross, seated an astonished young woman beside a fire, handed her his own handkerchief and rang for his aunt. He had not, he realized, felt the cold at all since he had come down the steps into the dark. He had not felt many things for a very long time. And now, in this small firelit room, with a stranger's ashes on his hand, he felt everything at once. Lady Constance Hawthorne was not a woman easily surprised. 63 years of living in English drawing rooms had trained her in the art of receiving news without blinking, and she had, in her time, received a great deal. But when a footman found her at the punch table and told her, in a carefully neutral voice, that the Duke had withdrawn from the ball and wished her to attend him in the east drawing room, and that there was a young lady with him, and that the young lady appeared to be wearing a laundry smock, Lady Constance set down her glass with a small decisive click. "Is she crying?" she asked. "No, my lady. She is sitting very still by the fire. His Grace is standing. He has not sat down." "Has he spoken?" "He has asked for tea, my lady. And for you." Lady Constance absorbed this intelligence without alteration of expression. Then she said, quite mildly, "I shall go directly. Fetch Mrs. Rhodes and tell her to bring a warm shawl, the green one from my own dressing room, and a clean pair of stockings from the chest at the foot of my bed. And do not mention this matter to anyone, most especially not to Lady Margaret Ashcroft. If she inquires after her stepdaughter, you are to tell her that Miss Ashcroft has taken ill and will be escorted home directly." "My lady," the footman said, "Lady Margaret Ashcroft has already left the ball." Lady Constance raised one eyebrow. "Has she indeed? How interesting." She went to the east drawing room. What she found there was not what she had expected, which was rare enough in itself to justify the journey. She had expected a weeping young lady. She had expected a cold and terse nephew managing a social catastrophe. What she found, when she opened the door, was her nephew standing at the mantel with his hands clasped behind his back in a posture she recognized from his boyhood, the posture of a boy who did not know what to do with his own joy and was attempting to disguise it as gravity. And a young woman on the settee with ashes smudged across her cheekbone, the Duke's own handkerchief clenched in her lap, and a look upon her face that Lady Constance had seen only a very few times in her life. It was the look of a person who had just discovered, after a long winter of being invisible, that she had been seen. Lady Constance closed the door behind her with great care. "Alaric," she said. "Aunt." He did not turn from the mantel, but she saw the color in the back of his neck. "Aunt, may I present Miss Seraphina Ashcroft? Miss Ashcroft rode here tonight. Without carriage. Without escort. Without, if I have understood her correctly, the smallest intention of being married to anyone. She has, I believe, reached a point of difficulty at her family home which I would very much like you to hear her describe in her own words, because I find that if I hear the words again, I am likely to do something for which my valet, had I one, would have to mend my coat." Seraphina rose, unsteady. "Your Grace, please. I did not come to bring a complaint. I did not come to sit down, dear," said Lady Constance, with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with the steel in her eye. "You are shaking. My nephew is not a violent man. Whatever he threatens to do to your coat, he will not do tonight. Alaric, ring for tea. Mrs. Rhodes is bringing clothes. Miss Ashcroft, I am Lady Constance Hawthorne, and I should very much like to be your friend, if you will permit it. Will you tell me your story?" Seraphina sat, and in the small firelit room, in a voice that wavered at the beginning and steadied as it went on, she told it. Not all of it. She did not have the language yet, and she did not know this kind woman well enough to entrust her with the deepest griefs. But she told her about the gown. She told her about her mother's embroidered silver thread. She told her about the candle that had been tipped over, in a room where there had been no candles lit until that afternoon, and about Annalise's carefully practiced tears, and about her stepmother's gloves, smoothed over her hands with the little satisfied motion of a woman closing a trap. She spoke without self-pity. That was the thing Lady Constance would remember afterwards, and would speak of, years later, when she told the story to her grandchildren. The girl spoke without self-pity. She spoke as though describing a battle that she had not expected to win, and at which she had, nevertheless, declined to surrender. When she finished, Alaric was no longer at the mantel. He was sitting in the chair opposite her, his elbows on his knees, his long hands laced together, his eyes fixed upon the carpet. He did not look at her. Seraphina understood why. He did not trust his face. "Well," said Lady Constance at length. "I see." She rose. She crossed to the settee. She sat down beside Seraphina, and she took the girl's cold hands into her own papery warm ones. "You will stay here tonight," she said. "No, do not argue with me, child. It is not proper, but neither was anything that was done to you this afternoon, and we shall deal with propriety in the morning with lawyers. Tonight, you will have a bath and a bed and a warm meal, and you will sleep in a house in which no one will ever again raise a candle near anything you love. Do you understand?" Seraphina's eyes filled. "Yes," she whispered. "Good. Now, Alaric." Lady Constance did not turn her head. "Stand up and find something to do with yourself before you frighten the girl. You have not blinked in 3 minutes." He stood up. He had the grace to look briefly mortified. "I shall go and see to the carriages," he said, and left the room. In the corridor outside, he leaned his forehead against the cool panel of the door and closed his eyes. He stood like that for a long time. The ball guttered out by 2 in the morning. The carriages rolled away into the dark. The candles were snuffed. The servants, silently, and with the discretion that large old households teach their people, removed the evening and folded it away. Seraphina Ashcroft slept in the blue bedroom on the south side of the house, in a linen nightgown too long for her, beneath a counterpane embroidered with swans. Lady Constance sat up in her own room, writing letters. And the Duke of Ravencross did not sleep at all. He sat in his study, with the fire dying in the grate, and he looked at the handkerchief she had returned to him, which still carried, faintly, the smell of smoke. He thought about Cecilia. He thought about her for a long time, because he felt he owed her the effort, and because he was frightened of what he had felt on the terrace steps. "Would you be angry with me," he asked her silently, "if I did not keep my promise?" He could not hear her answer. He had never been able to hear her voice since she died, and he had long ago stopped pretending to himself that he could. But he found, sitting there in the cooling room, that he did not any longer feel as though she required the promise of him. He had made the promise alone, at her graveside, in a grief that he now recognized as a kind of madness. She had not asked for it. She had asked for nothing, because by the end she had been beyond asking. Please, he thought, to nothing in particular. Let this not be another kind of madness. He went to bed at 4. He dreamt of a woman riding a gray horse up a long pale road, and when he woke, the sun was already high. In the days that followed, the county did nothing but talk. Lady Margaret Ashcroft returned home from the ball at midnight in a state of such high disarrangement that her maid was afraid of her. She threw a porcelain shepherdess against the wall of her dressing room. She wept, though not for any reason that admitted of comfort. At dawn she composed herself, and at 9:30 she sent a footman to Ravencross Manor with a polite and desperate note requesting the immediate return of her dear stepdaughter, who had behaved, the note insinuated without quite stating, in a manner that did not reflect well upon the family, and who was needed at home for a serious discussion about her conduct. The Duke's reply was delivered to her by the same footman, 3 hours later, upon creamy paper that bore the Ravencross crest in black wax. It read, in its entirety, "Madam, Miss Ashcroft is the guest of my aunt and is in no danger. She will return to your household when, and only when, she wishes to do so. I remain, your obedient servant, Ravencross." Lady Margaret read it twice. Then she sat down, because her knees would not hold her. She understood, as surely as she understood her own reflection, that she had made a mistake from which she might not recover. She had burned a wedding gown belonging to a girl she had always believed to be too meek, too sad, and too thoroughly broken to do anything but weep about it. She had done so in front of a daughter whose wits she had trained for years to register only what was convenient. She had not believed her stepdaughter capable of getting up off that courtyard floor. She had not believed her stepdaughter capable of saddling a horse. She had miscalculated. She set about, at once, the long, grim business of correction. If you are hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Now, back to Ravencross Manor, where a young woman in a borrowed morning dress was taking her first breakfast in the house of a man who had, the night before, looked at her as though she were the first real thing he had seen in years. Seraphina stayed for 3 days. She stayed because Lady Constance refused to let her leave, and because a solicitor was arriving on the 4th day from London, and because her father, it transpired, had left provisions in his will that Lady Margaret had not quite managed to set aside. There was money in trust for Seraphina, not a great fortune, but enough, and there was a small cottage in Devon that had been her mother's, which Lady Margaret could not sell, and which Seraphina had not known existed. "He meant you to have it," Lady Constance said, reading the copy of the will which she had obtained by methods she did not choose to explain. "He meant you to have it at 21. You are 22 next month, my dear. You have been kept ignorant of your own freedom for over a year." Seraphina did not weep. She had done most of her weeping in the blue bedroom on her first night, quietly, into the embroidered pillow. She had decided, by morning, that if she was going to build a new life, she would not spend it looking backwards. She walked in the gardens. She took her meals with Lady Constance in the small dining room, because the great one was too much. She read in the library, and the Duke of Ravencross, who had made it understood to his household that Miss Ashcroft's privacy was to be respected absolutely, contrived, quite without planning, to encounter her once or twice a day. On the first morning, in the breakfast room, she looked up from her coffee to find him in the doorway, arrested, as though he had come in expecting to be alone. "Forgive me," he said. "It is your house, your grace." "Alaric, I cannot. You did last night. Last night I was not sure you were real." He came in, then, and sat down opposite her. There was a quiet between them that was not uncomfortable, but it was not, quite yet, easy. He watched her for a moment over the rim of his coffee cup. She was wearing one of Lady Constance's old morning dresses. It was several decades out of fashion. It did not suit her. He thought that nothing, at that moment, could possibly have suited her better. "Miss Ashcroft, your grace, what did your mother call you?" The question took her by surprise. She blinked. "Sarah," she said, after a moment. "She called me Sarah? Then I shall call you Miss Ashcroft until you tell me otherwise, and I wish you to know only that the name Sarah exists in the world and is safe. I will not take it up without your invitation." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought, although the thought was new and strange enough that she did not trust it, "I have known this man for 12 hours, and he has done me more courtesies already than my stepmother has done me in 6 years. "Thank you," she said. He inclined his head. He asked her, carefully and without pressing, whether she had slept. He asked her, carefully and without pressing, whether his aunt had given her any trouble. She smiled, which he noted, because she had not smiled at him before. She said his aunt had given her a book of poetry and a pair of stockings, and had recommended both with equal firmness. "That sounds like her," he said. They finished their coffee. He rose. At the door he paused. "Miss Ashcroft, if, during your stay, you find yourself wanting for anything, you will ask. You will not stand upon ceremony with me. I should take it ill." "You would take it ill if I asked you for something?" "I would take it ill if you felt you could not." He went out. She sat in the morning light, holding her empty coffee cup in both hands, and found that she was smiling at nothing. They walked together, on the second afternoon, through the West Garden. It was Lady Constance who proposed it, in the manner of a woman who believed strongly in the medicinal effects of fresh air and who was, perhaps, not unwilling to have her nephew looked after for an hour by someone other than herself. "You will take Miss Ashcroft around the yew walk, Alaric, and you will show her your grandmother's roses. I am going to put my feet up, because I am an old woman and because I have earned it." Alaric offered his arm. Seraphina, more practiced in the small courtesies of a house by now, took it. The yew walk was a long green corridor of ancient hedges, so old that their interiors had hollowed out into little rooms of shadow and root. Birds shuffled in them. The gravel was pale, almost white, and it crunched beneath their feet in the companionable way of good gravel on a calm day. They did not speak for a long time. That did not trouble either of them. Near the end of the walk, at a stone bench set beneath a pale rose in full second bloom, he stopped. He did not invite her to sit, but he did not walk on. She looked up at him. "I must tell you something," he said. "Yes. 3 years ago I was married." The bird in the yew beside them fell silent. She felt her chest constrict, but she did not let it show upon her face. "Yes," she said. "I had heard. A little." Her name was Cecilia. She died of influenza 3 months after our wedding. I buried her in the chapel yard on the east side of the house, and I promised her, and myself, that I would not marry again. I see. I do not wish to mislead you. If my conduct on the terrace the other night misled you, I do beg your forgiveness. I did not intend it to. I intended, only, to be honest, which I have lately got out of the habit of. She nodded, slowly. She could not tell whether her heart had gone quiet or very loud. Your Grace, you have not misled me. I came here with no expectations at all. I still have none. He looked at her with something very close to pain. Miss Ashcroft, that is not precisely what I was saying. I do not understand. No, he said. I am not sure I do either. But I find, having made that promise, that I do not now know what to do with it. And I find I do not know what to do with you. And I find that I have not, to my own memory, spoken so many words in one morning in 3 years. So I thought you should know these things. I did not wish, when I said your name a little while ago at breakfast, for you to think I was careless of what it meant to say it. She was very still. Thank you for telling me. You are welcome. I think it is all I wish to say. He offered his arm again. They walked on. When, a little further down the walk, his sleeve brushed her hand, neither of them drew away. On the 3rd afternoon, the solicitor arrived. His name was Mr. Peregrine Finch, and he was a short, tidy, gray-eyed man who had worked for the Hawthornes for 40 years and who was unimpressed by anything. He read the provisions of Seraphina's father's will aloud in Lady Constance's sitting room, and he laid out, in terms that even Seraphina could follow, the extent of her independence. The money was not great. The cottage was small, but they were hers. They were, legally and irrevocably, hers. She did not need to return to her stepmother's house for so much as a handkerchief. Mr. Finch had already, at Lady Constance's discreet instruction, arranged for her personal effects to be collected from her bedroom at the Ashcroft house by a trusted housekeeper and delivered to Ravencross. The housekeeper's report, said Mr. Finch, consulting a sheet, indicates that a number of items which ought to have been your mother's, including a small jeweler box, a prayer book, and several letters, have been mislaid in your stepmother's custody. I believe, Miss Ashcroft, that with your permission I can retrieve them. Lady Margaret's hold upon this household is rather weaker than she has been in the habit of pretending. Seraphina thought of the silver-embroidered gown. She thought of 12 years of tissue paper. She thought, quite suddenly and without warning, that she would like the prayer book very much. Please, she said, please do retrieve them. Mr. Finch inclined his head and made a note. It shall be done within the week. After he left, Seraphina sat for a long time by the window. The world had rearranged itself around her in a way she had not yet understood. She was not destitute. She was not powerless. She was not, as she had been told so many times in the last 6 years that she had come to half believe it, a burden upon anyone. She had a cottage. She had a name. She could leave Ravencross tomorrow if she wished. She could, if she wished, never return. She did not want to leave. This was the thought that frightened her. Lady Margaret Ashcroft had not been idle. While her stepdaughter was being gently dismantled and rebuilt within the walls of Ravencross Manor, Lady Margaret was, in her drawing room in the house on the Ashcroft estate, making her corrections. She understood, within a day, that her stepdaughter could not be fetched back by force. She understood, within 2 days, that the Duke of Ravencross had taken a personal interest of a sort that Lady Margaret had not, in her own courtship and marriage years, ever elicited from any man, and that if she approached him directly, she would lose any remaining standing in his eyes. She understood, within 3 days, that she had one weapon left. She had the one thing that only she possessed. She had a story. The story did not need to be true. It needed only to be plausible, to be repeated in enough drawing rooms, and to reach the Duke of Ravencross by enough different mouths that he could not easily dismiss it. The story she settled upon was this: that her stepdaughter, poor Seraphina, had always been an unstable girl, prone to lies, prone to sudden fits of grief over her mother's death, prone, most regrettably, to fabricating cruelties against herself in order to gain the sympathies of strangers. That the ruined gown had not been destroyed by any hand of Lady Margaret's, but by Seraphina herself, in one of her fits, which Lady Margaret had been attempting to manage privately out of love for her late husband's memory. That Seraphina had fled to Ravencross not out of injury, but out of a calculated ambition to secure the Duke, whom she had long admired from a distance, and who, being a man recently widowed and much to be pitied, had been taken in by her pretty suffering. That Lady Margaret herself was heartbroken, that she had tried, these 6 years, to be a true mother to the girl, that her efforts had been repaid in shameless manipulation. It was, as lies go, very well constructed. It flattered its listeners by allowing them to be in possession of information the Duke was not. It punished Seraphina without appearing to. It rehabilitated Lady Margaret in the very act of accusing her. It began to move through the county on the 4th day. It passed from Mrs. Lytton to Mrs. Beauchamp to the wife of the vicar, and from the wife of the vicar to Lady Pemberley, who was Lady Constance's oldest correspondent and who wrote, at once, from a genuine desire to be kind, a long letter to Constance at Ravencross warning her of certain rumors concerning the young person in her care and urging her, with many protestations of affection, to consider her own household's reputation. The letter arrived on the 5th morning. Lady Constance read it over her toast. She did not mention it to Seraphina. She did not, at first, mention it to Alaric either. She read it a second time. She poured herself a fresh cup of coffee. She went to her writing desk, and she composed, in terms of frigid politeness, a reply informing Lady Pemberley that she had known Miss Ashcroft for 6 days and had already formed a more accurate estimate of her character than Lady Margaret Ashcroft had formed in 6 years, and that any future communication upon the subject would be taken as a direct affront. Then she went to find her nephew. The Duke was in the stable yard. It was the 6th day of Seraphina's stay, and he had, that morning, been teaching her to ride properly. She had never, before coming to Ravencross, set any horse but Hetty, and he had discovered, with a pleasure he could not quite account for, that she was brave and light-handed and laughed when the mare he gave her put her ears back and pretended to be affronted. Lady Constance found them in the yard. Seraphina was dismounting. She was laughing. The Duke was laughing. Lady Constance had not heard her nephew laugh aloud in the open air in 3 years. She stood for a moment in the archway and let herself look at them. Then she walked across the cobbles. She said, in a voice that was gentle but unmistakable, "Alaric, a word in the study, when Miss Ashcroft has gone in. Miss Ashcroft, my dear, Mrs. Rhodes is asking for you about the gray silk. I think it may be ready for its fitting." Seraphina, pleased, hurried away to the house. Alaric looked at his aunt. "What is it?" She gave him the letter. He read it standing in the yard, with the smell of horses around him and his hand still warm from where Seraphina's had brushed it, helping her down. He read it twice. He read it a third time. His face did not move. When he finished, he folded the letter once, very precisely, and handed it back to his aunt. "Thank you for showing me this, Aunt. Alaric, I should like the carriage brought round in half an hour, please. I am going to call upon Lady Margaret Ashcroft." "Alaric, I do not think—" "No," he said, and his voice was very quiet. "I do not think either. That is why I am going now, before I think." Lady Margaret was at home. She had made a point, for 5 days, of being visibly at home, in case the Duke should condescend to come. She had rehearsed, in her mind, a dozen different tones. She had settled on grieved dignity. She had put on a gown of deep mourning gray, although she was not in mourning for anything, and she had ordered tea to be ready the moment he arrived. When the butler announced him, she rose. She pressed one hand briefly to her bodice, as though to still a fluttering heart. "Your Grace." The Duke of Ravencross did not remove his hat. He did not sit. He stood in the middle of her drawing-room with his gloves still on and his greatcoat unbuttoned, and he looked around the room as though he were pricing it. "Madam, I am so deeply relieved you have come. I have been in a state of the most dreadful anxiety. My poor Seraphina, madam. You will not speak her name." It was said so softly that for a moment Lady Margaret did not hear it as what it was. Then she did. She closed her mouth. "I have come," the Duke said, "to make 3 things clear to you. I will not sit down. I will not accept tea. I will not stay beyond the brief time it takes to say these 3 things, and then I shall go, and I shall not come here again, and you will understand, by tomorrow morning, why." She stared at him. "First, I am aware of the story you have been telling your acquaintances this week. I am aware of its particulars. I do not require you to admit or deny it. I inform you only that I am aware of it, and that every person of consequence in this county will be aware, by this evening, that I know it to be a lie, and that I hold its author in absolute contempt. Your Grace, second, your stepdaughter is of age. Her father, as you well know, left her sufficiently provided for that she is under no necessity to return to your household. Her personal effects, including certain articles belonging to her late mother which have been in your wrongful possession, will be collected this afternoon by my solicitor's clerk, accompanied by 2 of my men. You will provide every item on his list. If you do not, legal proceedings will begin tomorrow at my expense. I mention the expense only because I wish you to understand that I consider the matter inexhaustibly worth pursuing. Lady Margaret's face had gone the color of tallow. Third, he paused. He took, for the first time, half a step closer to her. His voice dropped, not in volume, but in temperature. You burned her mother's wedding gown, madam. I do not say this as an accusation. I say it as a thing that I know, as surely as I know my own name. I will not pursue you for it under the law, because the law was not written to repair such an injury, and because Miss Ashcroft does not wish it, and because her wishes are, to me, decisive. But you will understand me when I tell you that it is the last thing of hers that you will ever touch. You will not write to her. You will not call upon her. You will not mention her name in any drawing room in this county in which your voice might be overheard. If you require a reason to be offered to society for this sudden reticence, you will invent one. I am confident you will find the exercise within your powers. She had begun, without realizing it, to tremble. Your Grace, good day, madam. He left. He went down her steps, past her bewildered butler, past her housemaid peering out from behind a half-closed door, and out into the pale autumn sunshine. He got into his carriage. He sat down. He put his hands flat upon his knees. He drew one deep breath, and then another, and then another. He found that his hands were shaking. It was not, he realized, with anger. The anger had been spent. His hands were shaking because he had, in a drawing room belonging to a woman he despised, used the phrase her wishes are, to me, decisive, and he had heard himself say it, and he had known, in saying it, that it was the truest thing he had said aloud since he had stood at his wife's grave 3 years ago. He closed his eyes. He thought, with great quietness, what am I doing? And he thought, with equal quietness, that he was no longer certain it mattered whether he knew. He was doing it anyway. He did not go straight back to Ravencross. He had the driver take him to the churchyard instead. He walked, alone, through the low stone gate, past the yew tree that had stood there since the Reformation, and down the gravel path to the chapel on the east side. He stood at Cecilia's grave for a long time. He did not speak. He had never been able to speak aloud to her since she died. But he stood, and he looked at her name cut into the stone, and he felt, for the first time, that he was not visiting her as a penitent. He was visiting her as one visits a beloved friend to whom one has news. When he left the churchyard at dusk, he had decided nothing. He had promised nothing. But he had admitted, to the cold air and to the grass and to the woman whose bones lay quiet beneath it, that something in him had begun to live again. He rode home. What he did not know, as his carriage rolled between the hedges toward Ravencross, was that Lady Margaret Ashcroft, at the precise moment his wheels cleared her gate, had already been at her writing desk for a quarter of an hour. That she was composing, not in dignity and not in grief, but in a white-hot rage that she had never in her life permitted herself to feel. A letter. That the letter was not being sent to Ravencross. It was being sent to a man in London whom she had not spoken to in 15 years, and whose existence the Duke of Ravencross had almost forgotten, and whose claim upon the young woman currently sleeping under the Duke's roof, if pressed, would, in the strict and terrible mathematics of English inheritance law, not be easy to deny. The letter was short. It contained only 3 lines. But Lady Margaret, when she sealed it, permitted herself, for the first time in a week, to smile. She had, after all, one more card to play. And the Duke of Ravencross, riding home through the dusk with his eyes on the first star of the evening, had no idea at all that it was already in the post. The man from London arrived on a Tuesday. His name was Mr. Silas Vaughan, and he was a cousin of Seraphina's mother, removed enough by blood that Seraphina had never heard his name spoken in her childhood, and close enough by law that when he stood in Lady Constance's morning room with a sheaf of papers in his gloved hand, The Duke of Ravencross understood, within the first 2 sentences, that the situation had become grave. Miss Ashcroft's cottage in Devon, Mr. Vaughan said, was held in entail. It passes, under the original grant, to the nearest male heir of her mother's line. That is myself. I do not doubt Miss Ashcroft's father intended well. I do not doubt the cottage meant a great deal to his late wife. But good intention does not override a properly drawn entail, Your Grace. The cottage is mine. The small income attached to it is mine. I have been, until this week, ignorant of my own rights. I am now informed of them. I intend to exercise them. Seraphina sat very still. Alaric, standing behind her chair, laid his hand upon its back. He did not touch her, but his hand was there, and she knew it was there, and she did not, this time, permit the thing inside her chest to buckle. Mr. Vaughan, said Lady Constance, you have been informed of your rights by whom? Mr. Vaughan hesitated. Only for a moment. By a letter, my lady. From. The writer preferred anonymity. I am sure she did, said Lady Constance. Mr. Vaughan was not a cruel man. He was only a man, as Alaric would later put it, who had been handed a lamp by someone standing in the dark, and had not thought to ask why. But the law, in this small matter, was as he had stated it. The cottage in Devon was not Seraphina's. It had never truly been hers. Her father had believed what his wife's family had told him years ago, and his wife's family had been wrong. Seraphina rose. She thanked Mr. Vaughan for the courtesy of coming in person. She went out of the room. Alaric found her half an hour later in the yew walk, at the stone bench under the pale rose. She was not weeping. She was sitting with her hands folded upon her lap in the posture he had first seen her use in a courtyard full of ashes, which was the posture of a woman deciding, again, to keep breathing. He sat down beside her. Sarah. She looked at him. He had not used the name before. She did not correct him. I am not, she said carefully, going to fall apart. I wish you to know that. I did not fall apart when my gown burned. I am not going to fall apart over a cottage. I know. I only need a moment. Take as many as you require. They sat. A blackbird moved in the hedge. The afternoon was very still. I have nothing, she said at length. Not truly. The money from my father will keep me modestly for some years, but the cottage was the thing I imagined living in. I had been imagining it for 6 days. I am a little surprised by how much I had let myself imagine it. Sarah. Yes. Marry me. She did not move. I am not asking you, he said, because you have lost a cottage. I am asking you because I cannot conceive of the rest of my life without asking you, and because I have been composing the question in my head since the evening you rode up my drive, and because a man who has been 3 years dead does not get to keep putting off the moment of saying aloud that he is alive. I have loved my wife. I love her still. I have understood, this week, that loving her does not require me to refuse the rest of what is offered to me. She would not have wished it. I do not wish it. He stopped. He had not. He realized, drawn breath. I have very little to offer you that you do not already see. A house that is too large. An aunt who will terrify your children. A grief that I do not pretend will vanish. But I have a name that is my own to give, and a promise that, once given, will not be revised, and I have, I find, a heart that was not as thoroughly buried as I believed. All of it is yours, if you will have it. I ask for nothing back. If you refuse me, you will remain here as long as you wish, and you will leave when you choose, and I will never speak of this again. She was looking at him. Her eyes were very bright. Alaric. Yes. You cannot ask me such a thing on an afternoon. I have just lost a cottage. I shall not know, afterwards, whether I said yes out of love or out of gratitude. Then take a month. Take a year. Take the rest of the autumn. I shall still be here. Will you? I shall still be here. She looked at him for a long time. Then she reached out, very slowly, and laid her hand against the side of his face. I do not need a month, she said. It was Lady Constance who insisted upon the church. Not a small ceremony, she said. Not a hurried one. The county had spent 3 weeks whispering about Seraphina Ashcroft. The county would now be required to attend her wedding. The church was full. The pews held, among others, the Falks and the Beechams and the Littons and Lady Pemberley, who had written to Lady Constance an apology of such length and such humility that Lady Constance had, at length, forgiven her. The pews held Mrs. Rhodes, the housekeeper, who cried. The pews held Hetty's old groom, whom Alaric had hired away from the Ashcroft stables at a wage the Ashcroft estate could not match. The pews did not hold Lady Margaret Ashcroft. She had gone, it was understood, to visit a sister in Scotland. She was not expected to return soon. Annalise was there. She sat in the back, alone, in a gown of sober green. She had written her stepsister, 3 days before, a letter so unvarnished in its remorse and so unadorned in its grief that Seraphina, reading it, had discovered that she could forgive a 16-year-old girl many things. She had written back. She had invited her to the wedding. Annalise had wept over the invitation for an afternoon and had come. Seraphina walked up the aisle in a gown of ivory silk. It was not her mother's gown. Her mother's gown was ashes and could not be remade. But Lady Constance had, in the weeks between, quietly arranged for a London seamstress to embroider silver thread along the bodice of the new gown, in a pattern copied from a sketch that Seraphina had drawn from memory one evening by the fire. The thread caught the light as she walked. Her father's prayer book, recovered at last by Mr. Finch from Lady Margaret's writing desk, was in her hand. The Duke of Ravencross waited for her at the altar. He had not, his aunt noted with satisfaction, blinked in 3 minutes. When she reached him, he took her hand. He did not speak at first. He only looked at her, with the look that Lady Constance had seen once before, in a firelit drawing room, across a handkerchief smelling of smoke. "Sarah," he said, very softly, so that the vicar could just hear it and the first pew could not. "I am very glad you came." She smiled. Her eyes were wet. "I am very glad," she said, "that you did not send me away." They were married on a gray autumn morning, and the sun came out halfway through the vows, which Lady Constance afterwards maintained was an omen, although she did not specify of what. They lived at Ravencross. They lived there for a very long time. Their first child was a daughter, who was christened Beatrice for Alaric's mother and Ellen for Seraphina's, and who was, by the age of 3, the tyrant of the house. Their second child, a son, was the 8th Duke of Ravencross in his turn, many years later, and he was a solemn gray-eyed boy who grew up to be a solemn gray-eyed man, and who was, in every respect that mattered, kinder than his father had been at his age, because his father had decided from the day of his birth that no son of his would inherit silence. Lady Constance lived to see both her great-grandchildren. She died in her sleep at 81, in the blue bedroom on the south side of the house, which had become, by then, the room she preferred. Seraphina kept her mother's prayer book in a small drawer beside her bed. She kept the handkerchief Alaric had given her on the first night, washed and folded, in the same drawer. The ash had never entirely come out of it. She did not mind. Some things were the better, she had decided, for carrying a little smoke. On the evening of their 20th wedding anniversary, the Duke of Ravencross walked with his wife in the yew walk, past the stone bench where he had once asked her a question on an afternoon she had just lost a cottage. It was autumn again. The rose was in its second bloom. She was in gray silk, the exact color of the evening she had ridden up his drive unannounced. "Sarah." "Yes." "Do you remember what you said to me on the steps that first night?" "I said a great many things. You said you had not come to be married. You said you had come because, if you had stayed in that courtyard another moment, you would have forgotten who you were." "Yes. I have been thinking," he said, "that I owe you a great deal for that ride. I do not know that I have ever thanked you for it properly." She stopped walking. She turned to him in the pale gold light. She laid her hand against his face, in the gesture she had used in this very walk half a life ago. "Alaric." "Yes. You did not need to thank me. You came down the steps." He took her hand. He pressed his lips to her palm, and they walked on, together, toward the long-lit house, as the first star of the evening came out above the chimneys of Ravencross. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.